Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this first webinar of a webinar series organized by NetworkNature. I am Frédéric Lemaitre. I will be facilitating this webinar. I am a Science Society Science Policy Officer for Biodiversity Plus, which is the European Partnership on Biodiversity. And as such, we are a partner in NetworkNature. NetworkNature is a resource on nature-based solutions. It's a European project funded by the Horizon 2020 framework program of the European Commission, and it materializes in an online platform on nature-based solutions at networknature.eu, and the main activities are around synthesizing knowledge, building and expanding a community around NBS, informing the science policy interface and accelerating uptake of NBS. Okay. And so, as I mentioned, this webinar is the first of a NetworkNature webinar series, and we are focusing this time around on knowledge gaps on nature-based solutions. And so, to do so, we have invited three speakers this morning to share views on the topic of nature-based solution knowledge gaps. And these are Mariam El Arak, who is a scientific officer for the European Biodiversity Partnership, Biodiversity Plus, and as such conducted work on knowledge gaps under NetworkNature. And also, of course, brings a perspective from programming and funding of research and innovation. She will be followed by Laura Wendling, who is an environmental scientist leading nature-based solutions research team at VTT Technical Center in Finland, and Laura is involved in EU projects on nature-based solutions and the famous European task forces of the Commission on nature-based solutions. And she will be followed by Laura Baroni this time, who is a senior policy analyst on biodiversity and ecosystems team of the Institute for European Environmental Policy, and will bring us a perspective more from the science policy interface. Okay, but before we get to the short introductions from our speakers on the topic, we wanted to ask you the question. So the participants here, you have the opportunity to use Slido. For those of you who are familiar, you will see a link in the chat, and you will be asked a question: where are we lacking nature-based solutions knowledge, in your opinion? And the opportunity here is to share your views on where are the most pressing knowledge gaps on nature-based solutions. Okay, I can need a few minutes to answer. Okay, not too much showing up for now. Indeed, so proper assessment of all. Okay, here it goes. Okay, so we have elements related to the benefits of NBS, so assessment of benefits, but also social benefits, engagement, finance opportunities, standards, and localized standards in particular, economic benefits as well, of course, impact, management, health and well-being impacts, important, okay. Upscaling of NBS, I think these costs and benefits, okay. We see the key terms showing up. I think, okay, hard to find information, important, okay. Monitoring, indeed, behind the benefits, measuring performance, and effects. You have clear monitoring questions as well, scalability. Okay, interesting. Seems like we're pretty much in line in our thinking. Citizens' involvement, also the role of social actors indeed is key. And applicability in different contexts. Synergies and trade-offs also important, interesting. And best practices and examples. Okay, I think we have a work plan. Effectiveness, I don't know why it comes out so big, but for sure, it's a key question. Okay. I think this relates closely to the topics we encounter also in our work in NetworkNature on knowledge gaps. And we see it's knowledge gaps, it's also application of knowledge and bridging the knowledge implementation gap, which strikes clearly here, and also empowering citizens and society in implementation of NBS. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for your excellent inputs. So now I can move to introducing the different speakers. And as mentioned, we will start with Mariam, who will provide us with an overview of NetworkNature's work on knowledge gaps. Please go ahead, Mariam.
Hi, thank you, Frédéric. And thank you everyone for coming to this presentation. I just wait for the slides. Yes. Thank you. And so I'll do my presentation on knowledge gap database that we developed here on NetworkNature. Next slide, please. So to give a little bit of context, so this database was created as part of a different stream of work toward the development of the next European NBS research and innovation roadmap that is being developed in NetworkNature. So the different stream of work were first a mapping of European NBS research and innovation projects, so kind of look at the evidence base in R&I on NBS in Horizon 20 project, Biodiversa, Interreg, and more. We also did a lot of strategic dialogue with programmers and funders, NBS experts, and policymakers. And lastly, we did this work on knowledge gaps, since it was really important for us to know what were the knowledge gaps on NBS to feed into this roadmap. And so we did it using both two streams of work, one a deck study on NBS and another one an online consultation on knowledge gaps toward the NBS community. Next slide, please. So to go into a little bit more detail in the methodology that we use, for the deck study, we analyzed 19 publications from European large-scale research and innovation initiatives, such as the European Task Forces, Biodiversa, Think Natures, and more, and also scientific paper that were searched using Google Scholar as well as Science Direct. And so we, 19 publications were analyzed, and gaps were identifying them when clearly stated as such in the publication. And this allowed us to collect 142 gaps, clearly unique gaps, that were then categorized into 27 broad gaps identified, so it's more to facilitate the analysis. Next slide, please. So this was for the desk study and for the online survey. So the survey was open for a month on the NetworkNature website and was shared on social media, as well as through channels that we could use, such as the European Task Forces, Biodiversa Network. And we collected 44 respondents from academics, but as well from some from national policymakers, NGOs, and SMEs. And this allowed us to identify 29 unique knowledge and implementation gaps that were relevant to NBS that we added to the other gaps to construct our knowledge gap database. So to go into more the analysis of this database, next slide, please. So what we did, we categorized into broad category, but also broad types of gap. And what we discovered was that the majority of the gaps that were collected were relevant to, can I have the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. Were relevant to NBS evaluation, so 41% of all the gaps were relevant to evaluation, followed closely with gaps related to technical design. And in third and fourth place, which were really close by, were gaps related to NBS capacity building or NBS governance. Next slide, please. And if we go into a little bit more detail, so here in this graph, you have the top 10 most cited, more represented broad category of gaps that we got from our database. And in a darker color, you have the gaps from the desk studies, and in lighter, we have the one from the online consultation. And what we can see is that for the gaps that I said were really presented was from the NBS evaluation side, with, as was present in the polls, cost benefits evaluation, effectiveness at different scale, across sociological contexts, but also the development of monitoring tool as well as systemic evaluation tools. And which was really interesting to see for us was the second most cited gaps was the one on awareness and capacity building, even though it was not as much represented overall. And it's interesting to see that it was really present in the online consultation, so from the NBS community more so than from the European publication that we analyzed. And also we have some important gaps related to the technical design of NBS, from linked to the synergies and trade-off between goals, but as well really important was the relationship between biodiversity, ecosystem services, and ecosystem function in the design of NBS. And lastly, one of the least represented gaps were the one on governance. So with the gaps on the approaches and governance system for best implementation of NBS that we found, which is the 10th last cited gaps in our graph. So this kind of a really quick overview of the analytics we were able to do in our from the database we collected. And next slide, please. And so here you can see it's a screenshot of the NetworkNature website where the knowledge gap database is hosted. So it is a searchable database when you can look at the gap description, the origin of the sources, the resources linked to it, as well as the broad topic that they are linked to. And you have a QR code to facilitate the access, and we'll put the link in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mariam. I should have mentioned already that you have a Q&A function. You can type in questions, and we will have time at the end of the webinar to take in questions from the floor. So thank you very much, Mariam, for this introduction or overview of the outcomes of the work of NetworkNature on knowledge gaps. I think we see how it relates clearly to some of the themes which came up into the poll to the audience. And so now I take the opportunity to pass on to Laura Wendling. As I said, she is leading the nature-based solutions research team at VTT Technical Center, Finland, and she will bring us more a perspective from research. Okay, please go ahead, Laura.
Okay. Thank you, Frederick. And thank you, Mariam, for such a nice overview of the NetworkNature database. So if I could have the next slide. I think that this really highlights the work that we have done on looking at performance and impact evaluation, addresses a lot of the issues that we've identified today. You know, here talking about how effectiveness is really one of these key things we need to understand. And if we look at the results from the survey that Mariam and her colleagues conducted, where 40% of the respondents said NBS evaluation was a real issue. So we hear over and over again that we would have more I guess, successful incorporation of NBS in a meaningful way into policy instruments at multiple levels, or, you know, we'd have better mainstream adoption of NBS if the evidence base were less fragmented and less discipline specific. But if we look at the umbrella of all these concepts and practices that NBS encompasses. Of course, starting out, our database or our knowledge is going to be a bit fragmented and discipline specific. So how are we working towards changing this, towards creating some kind of comprehensive knowledge base that covers all of the different facets of NBS and their benefits and co-benefits and trade-offs? We start with these European and global reports and assessments, and these are multiple levels. You know, we're everything from IPBS reports to individual reports from projects, but you know, collating all this information into a platform. So the NetworkNature Knowledge Platform does this really nicely, brings together all of these key reports, and I would highly recommend this as a good source of information for everybody. One of the other ways we've addressed this, and mostly what I'm going to talk about today, is the task forces that are focused on addressing critical issues related to NBS mainstreaming and implementation. But I don't want to move on before I mention that there are projects beyond Horizon 2020 that are also creating knowledge and directly contributing to our evidence base. And these are those under the Biodiversity and Climate Change Co-Fund Action, the new projects under Horizon Mission on Adaptation to Climate Change. There's the IUCN's Global Standards, and also the NBS initiative from the University of Oxford. And these are all really key resources for us. Could I have the next slide, please? So with all things, the more we know, the more we find out that we don't know, or the more new questions arise. So ultimately what we want is a really comprehensive, wide-ranging evidence base on NBS multifunctionality and the full range of benefits and trade-offs across all the major societal challenge areas. So I tried to kind of highlight some of the knowledge gaps that we have identified either through task force work or project work, and you know, through the work that Mariam and colleagues have done in the knowledge gap synthesis. I think that some of these kind of are slightly different, and what we've identified is more of a systematic analysis of social impacts, and in particular health and well-being impacts, where we can very, very clearly link the impact of NBS with an outcome. You know, separating multiple variables that contribute to a specific outcome. Both the realized and potential economic impacts, for example, through cost-benefit analyses and assessments of market potential, effectiveness of NBS across various social ecological contexts, and we also need to think about impacts on social equity and social justice. We need more evidence about this. You know, how do the co-creative processes that we implement affect equity and justice? Governance systems, financing issues, all these different approaches that support NBS. We need more evidence about this. You know, how does it work in different places, different scales? And again, stakeholder engagement, awareness, capacity building. I won't read through all of these. I think you guys can read as easily as I can, but we start from these more, you know, social and social ecological issues, and then move into very technical questions like, you know, what are the impacts of NBS on biodiversity and ecosystem services delivery? You know, roles in climate adaptation, and then how are the NBS themselves impacted by climate change? We hear a lot about nature-based solutions for flood mitigation, but quite a bit less on how NBS can be used to mitigate water scarcity. And this is an issue that I think is having, you know, increasing visibility, and something where we definitely need to do a bit more exploration. You know, scale, geographic scale, and performance and impact. And then finally, these longer term assessments. NBS are relatively new, or, you know, young concept, and we need these longer term assessments of their effectiveness, including, you know, the adaptive monitoring processes and any maintenance regimes. Next slide, please. I'm probably running close to my time, so one of the ways that we've addressed this is through the establishment of an integrated NBS assessment framework, and this was a 3-year effort by 17 EU-funded projects and related programs. There were 188 co-authors involved in the creation of these reports, and we expect that these are a living document, something that will continuously be updated and improved as we gain more knowledge and better knowledge. But what the handbook and the Appendix of Methods do now is they provide a guide to developing and implementing NBS and establishing scientifically valid monitoring and evaluation plans. The Appendix of Methods is quite a weighty tome. If you are struggling with not being able to get to sleep at night, you might pick this up and just start reading cover to cover. However, if you want to use it in a more useful way, it's about 1,200 pages of specific methodologies. And what we've done here is try to capture recommended methods and ways of monitoring, ways of recording the data and managing the data so that we can have a comprehensive evidence base that's, that receives contributions from all across Europe that enables meta-analysis. So we can compare between, a project in Greece and a project in Finland that do very different things but may have some common outputs. So not meant to be read cover to cover, but really useful. And then finally, it's all summarized in a summary for policymakers, which kind of gives those high-level messages and is really useful if you want to learn a little bit, get the taste of what each of these aspects is about, or you want to communicate it to a decision maker. And last slide. Another quite new output of some of the task forces that I think is incredibly useful and responds to a lot of the questions that we have is this report on the evaluation of NBS in a nature positive economy. So this was a contribution from 16 projects from Horizon 2020 and LIFE, and what it does is it tries to address these knowledge gaps related to economic benefits of NBS and what kinds of challenges are faced by nature-based enterprises. These slides will be available to you afterwards, so you can read the little blurb. This is just from the description of the report, but I think this is really critical because it highlights the role of nature-based solutions in a nature-positive economy and raises the awareness of how nature-based enterprises can deliver NBS. So I'll stop here so that we can continue on, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura, for this insightful talk into what the task force, especially on indicators, has been doing. Okay, so then I can pass on now. We can move more to the policy or science policy perspective with Laura Baroni, who is a senior policy analyst on biodiversity and ecosystems in the Institute for European Environmental Policy, and will tell us a bit more from the perspective of policy on knowledge gaps.
Thanks, Frederic. Good morning, everybody. So yes, I'll just comment very briefly on the policy implications. I'll try not to be too repetitive because I think some of the things I will bring up have already been mentioned in the past presentations. But if we can just go to the next slide. Thanks. Right, so we have seen in the last few years that nature-based solutions have been integrated as a concept in several EU strategies and action plans. Some of these explicitly mention nature-based solutions, for example, the European Green Deal communication, the new EU adaptation strategy, the EU bioeconomy strategy, the farm to fork strategy, the urban agenda for the EU. There's even a small mention of NBS in the Zero Pollution Action Plan. And besides these, we also have several other policy documents which promote NBS implicitly by referring to related concepts like green infrastructure or ecosystem-based approaches. So at least at the level of EU policymaking, we see this growing recognition that nature-based solutions can contribute to a variety of policy areas, but it's now important to ensure that this recognition also permeates to national and local levels of government and among practitioners in all the relevant sectors. And I think we can say that some of the knowledge gaps that have been mentioned so far in the previous presentations and that came up in the poll are among the barriers hampering a wider uptake of NBS on the ground. And we need to fill these gaps to ensure that there is a successful implementation of all these EU policies that promote NBS. If we could go to the next slide. So I tried to mention here some of the key gaps that we've identified through our research as well in the past years, or by talking to stakeholders and other experts. I will try not to be too repetitive because I think your answers to the first poll and also Mariam's and Laura's presentation also preempted some of these things that I have on my slides here. But just to reiterate the critical importance of the gap regarding NBS effectiveness and co-benefits. So we see that uncertainty over the effectiveness of nature-based solutions in addressing a particular problem is often what makes decision makers hesitant to select nature-based solutions over conventional so-called grey solutions. And similarly for the co-benefits of NBS, We know that NBS would often win out in a comparison with grey solutions if all the co-benefits were properly taken into account, but such co-benefits are seldom quantified, let alone monetized. So it's rather difficult in most cases to compare NBS and grey alternatives through a cost-benefit analysis, for example. And although there will always be some degree of uncertainty, since nature-based solutions are living systems and their impacts will be context-dependent, there is scope for expanding this evidence base on the effectiveness and benefits of NBS. We need more tools and resources that can really help decision makers quantify before implementation what will be achieved through an NBS that meets certain characteristics at a site with certain characteristics. And the work that Laura Wendling just mentioned, the work of the task forces of the Horizon projects on NBS and the other research projects from the last few years have been very important in this regard. And now I think that the essential thing now is to ensure that we continue building on these outputs in the next years, but also that these results also get disseminated to reach the right audiences on the ground, so the national, local decision makers, the various sectors that can really benefit from NBS and that can contribute to their implementation. And I wanted to mention also on the cost side, we often think that costs are easier to assess than benefits, and in some cases it is true, but I have found in previous research that it's actually quite difficult to identify even typical costs of NBS. And we see that there are sometimes fears, for example, that the maintenance costs over the long term would be too high. And so it would be useful to also have some more systematic compilations of the typical costs of nature-based solutions in various countries. And finally, these also have been mentioned before, so I won't dwell on these points for too long, but two areas in which further evidence would be helpful to facilitate the implementation of NBS policies relate to funding models and governance models. So on the funding side, I think there's a need for more systematic reviews of what has worked well, what hasn't, also on how to develop business cases for NBS projects to attract private finance. And we see that the Horizon NBS projects, for example, are making some headway in this regard, and it's important to continue building on that. And similarly, regarding governance, it would be helpful to have more evidence, more examples of successful governance models, including on how one can engage citizens and local businesses in the planning and maintenance of NBS. So I think I will leave it at that for now, and yeah, thank you, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Laura. Okay, so I think there's a clear alignment on the nature of these gaps, also between the audience and the three presentations this morning. So now we are going to move to more of a Q&A session. Maybe before we do so, we have a short poll again for you around who do you think should be more informed about nature-based solutions? And so you can answer via the Slido, and you see the link in the chat. So here the question is more about who do you think should be more informed on nature-based solutions? And I trust we will see elements on the screen shortly. I remind you also you can send in questions via the question function, the chat-like question function. And okay, so we can see the beginning of answers here. So local communities, consultants, okay, public authority, local authority planners, okay, everyone, decision makers, okay, and maybe I can use the opportunity also to begin this Q&A session with input from our panelists on this question. Who do you think should be more informed on nature-based solutions? And I can start with Laura Wendling. Okay, I see citizens, implementers, planning professionals. If you find a group that's not on the screen already, well done.
You know, I think, I personally think everyone should be more informed about nature-based solutions, because I think the more people who understand how much benefit we can gain, across ecological, environmental, social, economic domains, the more popular they'll become. So I'm going to have to go with everyone as my answer. But if I have a secondary answer, I think perhaps the implementers, the people who are involved in advising and in implementing, supporting our municipalities.
Yeah, indeed, interesting. I see a couple interesting points also raised on the screen now. So we have indeed maintenance personnel. I think we had something related to the healthcare sector, which is interesting as well. And also greenwashers. I guess they should be indeed better informed. I don't know, Laura Baroni, and then maybe Mariam, if you want to add anything to this.
I think I agree with everything that has been mentioned. It's difficult to come up with new ones, but maybe I would just say, I think it's important, the public authorities, decision makers at all levels, of course, but I would say especially those ones that are not working in environment and nature departments, so especially the decision makers in related sectors that could really benefit from NBS and make a contribution to their deployment. I think there's still more work to be done to reach those audiences as well. And I'm happy to see in the poll that things like health or industry and other sectors have been mentioned.
Indeed. Okay, so we have a few questions for you. Maybe first, I think there's a clarification mainly for Mariam around the scale of the study you did on nature-based solutions gaps, asking if it's EU or global.
Yeah, so we first started with the European publication because it was like the main sources we use, and then we kind of grew from there and from the scientific paper, but as well as the other more gray, we also use global aspect, but it's mainly from European sources since we were working on the European scale for the roadmap.
And maybe a follow-up comment also from the room that there are, I think some participants flagged additional EC programs which support projects on NBS. So I don't know if you want to comment on this as well.
I don't
think that are considered. I think
yeah,
maybe.
I don't see the one that they. Sorry, because I don't have access to the question.
I will share with you. It's a Green for Care, the link, but we'll have a check afterwards. I think maybe the key message is that this is something we're building on. So if you want to flag to Mariam and myself, I'm a facilitator, but I'm also involved in the work of NetworkNature. So I have to be honest with the and so I think it's typically these kind of inputs are very useful for us, and it's something we're looking to build on in the future. And maybe a question more for the three of you, and I don't know if you have different views or not on this, but there's a question on who do you think is best positioned to address these gaps? And then there's a more technical question about the knowledge gaps database, asking if someone will go through this database and look at how these gaps have been addressed at some point. Okay, so maybe I can start with the first larger part of the question. So who do you think is best placed to answer these gaps? I don't know if anybody wants to start.
I could have a go maybe. I mean, I think it will be, well, since we have different types of gaps, some are more, more related to the economics of NBS, some more on the technical side where you would need the ecology and so on. So I think there will need to be kind of cross-disciplinary collaboration and involvement of both science and policymakers to answer these. And we're already seeing some of this through the Horizon project. So we just need to upscale that and broaden it to a wider audience. But yeah, I think the scientific community from various disciplines, but also together with policymakers, because the policymakers can indicate what the precise questions are and what they need to know for their work, what they need the scientific community to answer.
And if I can just follow quickly, I think research, as I say, is really important, but more so like coordinated research, because I think we saw that there's like huge number of gaps from different contexts, from different social ecological contexts, and I think we need to work together as in the research community, even programmers and funders, to work toward the solving of these gaps. And I think that's one of the things we are working toward in the development of this roadmap on NBS, is to kind of put forward a way of collaboration and to the best implementation of this roadmap as well, for it to have synergies between programs, to work better together and to not do the same things over and over again, and to have redundancy. I think is also very important.
And I would add one thing here, and I think that we've really, Laura Baroni and Mariam have hit the nail on the head, but I would say that as a scientific community, research and practitioners, we have a duty to make sure that our message is disseminated widely. You know, we can't preach to the choir. We shouldn't only be talking to ourselves or publishing our results in wonderful, you know, scientific journals that not everyone has access to and not everyone can read. So it's up to us to reach these non-pro nature communities. Someone highlighted that in the Slido. But really make sure that the message is consistent and that it's getting to everybody who needs to hear it.
Okay, thank you very much to all three of you. I think we see indeed the transdisciplinary nature of addressing these gaps, and even more so when some of these gaps relate to knowledge implementation as well aspects. Okay, and we have a question specifically for Laura. I think you struck somebody when about the maintenance costs on the longer term. They were wondering if you have an example or a resource to share around why maintenance costs are higher for NBS than other technical measures in the long term, because this person would have assumed a priori the opposite.
Yeah, I actually think that in reality they're not necessarily higher. It just seemed to be a perception, and I can't think now if we've put this in any concrete report. But I remember it came up, for example, in some stakeholder interviews we did as part of it was also as part of a Horizon project a few years ago. So, for example, yeah, local authorities might be. It's not necessarily that the costs are higher, but there may be this perceived higher cost, thinking that this will take a lot of input to manage over the longer term. I'll have a think about it and see if we have any resources. I think when we try to document costs as part of a catalog on NBS, which we also produced as part of a Horizon project called Grow Green a couple of years ago, we compiled a sort of handbook of NBS where we tried to have some fact sheets on nature-based solutions. And I think in there we documented some cost figures as well, although they were very wide ranges. It was quite difficult to find figures. And I think we had some maintenance costs in there as well, some rough estimates from various studies. But yeah, I don't remember now if we ever confirmed that the costs are higher. My impression is also that they're not necessarily higher. My point was more that there's uncertainty about costs, and we need to clarify that to show, look, actually it's not as big as you fear. And then it also links to the issue of governance and how you can involve other stakeholders in the maintenance and the management of the NBS later on, such that the maintenance costs perhaps don't always have to fall on the local authority. Or yeah. So I will need to, maybe I can take your name or something and see if I can follow up if I find the reports.
Okay, we'll organize that. And yeah, I think it sends back also to the question of design of NBS. Is an NBS with high maintenance costs on the long term actually well designed and sustainable by design? I guess it's also part of the question. So we see these different aspects are interrelated. There's more of a conceptual question also. I can send them to you around. Somebody's wondering about the difference between nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches. I think we love these questions in the NBS field. I don't know if somebody wants to give it a shot at clarifying this aspect. It's a simple question. It's not the easiest.
I can make a go, and then perhaps we can all contribute. But I think ecosystem-based approaches fall squarely under the umbrella of MBS. I mean, they're clearly one of the preceding concepts that is strongly contributed to our current understanding of what nature-based solutions are. Nature-based solutions, though, take a little bit more systemic approach to explicitly addressing stakeholder engagement, biodiversity enhancement, and the economic or financial gains that come out. How about Mariam? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's really that ecosystem-based or part, as Laura said, or NBS. But as I say, yeah, I think it's NBS or more encompassing concepts with, I think, and even more link with like social benefits linked to social justice as well. I think that this aspect are more built into the NBS approaches overall than the ecosystem-based one. I think that's mainly the main differences that we can see. But sometimes I think they're also the same. So I think it's always sometimes quite hard to navigate between all those terms.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, I don't know, Laura, if you want to add to this.
Yeah, no, I think I agree there. We have a bunch of partly overlapping concepts, right? NBS, green infrastructure, ecosystem-based approaches, and they each have their specific history of how they came about, and they tend to be more popular in certain communities than others. But I think, yeah, it's in a way this multitude of concepts probably doesn't help in getting the message across to a public that's not always so informed about the various definitions. So maybe we need to reduce all of these to the key criteria. They all have in common working with nature to address certain challenges and to also benefit both society and biodiversity and the economy. So if this is the common denominator, perhaps we should stress this point better when we communicate to the wider public, that it doesn't really matter whether we speak about nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approaches or green infrastructure. In the end, what we want is to work with nature to benefit both biodiversity and people.
Okay, interesting. For the yeah, and so we have also a concrete question around the actions being put in place to fill the gaps. So the question is really concrete. Are there calls for research projects being developed across the sciences, for example, addressing gaps identified? Maybe we can ask the question like so, or so turn it around. What do you think should be the concrete steps to be put in place to fill these gaps? And I know it has to be a general answer because there's such a diversity of gaps in this database. Maybe I can let Mariam, it's maybe most easier for you to start answering more directly to this question.
Yeah, I think what I already talked about is that we are working on this European roadmap on research and innovation that is clearly linked to the knowledge gap database that we are developing, and to see what are the main objectives that we can have to solve those gaps in the different types of sector that we have and in different types of categories. And so we are into the development, and we also work really hard on the aspect to better implement this roadmap, because it's a good way to say, yes, we have those objectives, and now think of how do we want really to address them. So I think that's what we are doing. And I think for the more concrete way, I think Laura, you already presented when I can give you the floor on how in the task forces you are clearly working on those aspects to bridge those gaps.
I think that you sort of addressed it at this higher level. The experts who make the calls for funding have really closely looked at what do we not know, what do we still need to know, what's critical and essential to move forward. But the task forces, I think, are really fantastic, because instead of then having, say, 30 projects who are all kind of doing their own thing and developing their own tools and their own conclusions, we're able to come together and really synthesize all of the learnings and try to present that in a coherent way that moves things forward a little bit more quickly than if someone has to search through 30 different documents.
Indeed, Laura Baronier, I don't know if you want to, if you would like to comment on this.
No, I don't think there's much more I can say. I think I also appreciate the work of the task forces. I was briefly involved at some point when I was also working on one of these projects, and I think it's a it's a good step forward, and yeah, a way of bringing together all the various projects. I think what also needs to happen is to make sure that yeah, the outputs get disseminated further down the line as well. But that's been mentioned as well already too. So
that's clear. And yeah, I think it's clear what the implementation of these gaps in the NetworkNature context. What we're trying to do, what Mariam said, is really trying to stimulate, on the one hand, dialogue and coordination between programmers and funders, and implementation programs also, such as LIFE, for instance, and transdisciplinary programs like Biodiversa, Horizon Europe. So we're really trying to bring these types of actors around the table to indeed, in turn, generate calls for research projects or coordination actions, etc., that respond to these gaps. It relates also closely to the work of the task forces. And I think also it's important what Laura said on this database. It's also a tool, and this webinar, where what we're trying to do is to promote the use of this database as a tool for researchers to refer to gaps identified in research policy and science policy documents. And there you have a one-stop shop to be able to identify where you can route your research into the needs which are identified in this EU policy level. So we hope this is advancing on both sides of the coin. So the research programmers, funders, and the research performers as well. And when I say research, of course, it's research, innovation, implementation in a fully co-development, co-implementation way. I think it's clear. Okay. Maybe I can also, so feel free to keep on asking questions. We have a few here as well. So there's one more around the mainstreaming of nature-based solutions in different policy sectors, and around what would be the best way to achieve this mainstreaming in other policy sectors beyond the ones which are already heavily engaged today. And I can think of course, of research and innovation, environment, and then we know there are a number of others also who are interested on the topic. And maybe this is more of a question for Laura Baroni first, around the policy mainstreaming in other sectors.
Yeah, I think that the main thing that helps is to demonstrate the benefits, right? If we can really demonstrate to these other sectors how nature-based solutions can contribute to delivering on their specific objectives as well, then yeah, we can make headway in convincing these other sectors too of their value. But I was also thinking just now that maybe we need to also find more creative ways of doing that, not only by writing reports and case studies. So maybe we need more creative activities as well, like field trips and peer learning visits among local authorities or among practitioners from various sectors and policy fields. So to really demonstrate more on the ground what can actually be done with nature-based solutions and how it can benefit the lives of communities. Because maybe yeah, we sometimes produce very wonderful reports that we're very pleased with, but then we don't quite know to what extent they reach the audiences in the other sectors.
Indeed. Okay, Mariam, Laura, do you want to contribute anything to this aspect? Yeah, for sure, it's a challenge. We have a few additional questions coming in, pretty interesting. So maybe first a question to all of you. If you had to convince the government from a country, for instance, to implement and finance an NBS project, what would you tell them? And it's a large question, I guess, but from a general perspective, I think it might be interesting to highlight key aspects you would seek to, salient aspects of NBS you would seek to highlight to them. So I don't know if anybody wants to give a shot at this one. It's a bit out of the blue, but I think it's a good question.
All right, so say you have 1 minute in an elevator to convince somebody.
Yeah.
I think I would say that we know that we cannot address the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity without reconnecting our urban environments to the natural environment and restoring the ecosystem services where they've been degraded by anthropogenic activity. But this is important not only, in our cities, but also our communities, our rural communities, but making sure that we're working with the environment. We face so many changes and so many challenges, from climate change, biodiversity loss, a whole host of others, big societal issues. And so many of these can be addressed by nature-based solutions concomitantly. I would really encourage you to give it a shot. Let's see if we can make this work and improve livability, health, well-being, all of these things. That's my 1 minute elevator pitch for my decision maker.
I like it. Okay, Laura, Mariam, do you want to highlight anything else?
Yeah, I think Laura Wendling did a really good speech.
Yeah, it's hard.
But yeah,
It's
I
hard
think it's really hard to go after. But if there's one other thing, is like we have a lot to gain from implementing NBS, as I said, in the health sectors, in urban environment, for climate change, for disaster risk reduction. I think there's so many things that we can do. And I think it's really to see how we can, and even think systematically to kind of involve the climate change, the environment, society, solutions together. I think that's really, one of the main impact of NBS is to think systematically on problems and not just resolve just one aspect and think, how we can address this together to have the best result and to not have as many trade-offs as we want. I think that's the main aspect for NBS, if I could.
Yeah, I can only agree with what has already been said. So indeed, I think that's the critical point. It's NBS are an opportunity to tackle various problems simultaneously, and yeah, usually you will also save on some costs or draw on multiple benefits by implementing them. So that's the key message to bring. And yeah, I will make sure that next time I also have a couple of key figures in my pocket to take them out in the elevator, like some clear examples of the cost savings that were achieved by implementing an NBS for certain, I don't know, disaster risk reduction measures or
Yeah, for sure. Not easy to pitch an NBS which you don't know what it is. But okay, and there's a question also regarding the utilitarian aspect of NBS, and there's a question. I think it's interesting as well. Do you have any advice on how to deal with the critique on NBS that it is too solutions oriented, too utilitarian, and in some cases even perceived as colonial? So this last bit I was less aware about, but on the utilitarian side, it's clearly a very utilitarian concept as such. I don't know if you want to comment on this. I don't know if there's a clear answer, but if you want to comment on this aspect.
Yeah, I don't know. If I could just say is that as of now, we have very different view of NBS related to cultural context as well as a different country where we are implementing it. And it is true that sometimes it is seen as we're going to implement this without any involvement of local community. But I think for me, this are not NBS, because in my definition, at least, the implication of local community into the development of those NBS are really important and are essential for it to work the best way. So I think if there's one thing that we can do is really put forward the implication of local community into the development as a really important standards of building NBS. I think that could be the best way to avoid those really bad things that is happening sometimes. And for the utility, I don't think we are using nature. I think we are working with it. But I think it's kind of a different view, and I don't know if there's a really simple answer to answer this.
I think it's a good answer already. Yeah, Laura?
I think the only thing that I would add here is that I think Mariam's hit the nail on the head. I'd not heard of NBS being considered sort of colonialism, but I can see how that they could be perceived that way without really good knowledge and social capacity building as part of the NBS process. And I think we need to remember that co-creation is integral, co-creating with our stakeholders. And it's very different than saying, we have an idea already and kind of a tailor-made solution, and we're going to consult you about what you want it to look like. I mean, it really needs to be a co-creative process where everybody's involved, everyone's engaged in defining what the solution is and defining what the problems are, because there may be things that come from our stakeholders, and quite likely things that coming from our stakeholders that we hadn't considered. Decision makers, the technical experts don't know everything, clearly. And the stakeholders need to really be part of that. And I think that can get over that idea of it being colonialism or having that kind of flavor, and certainly help with NBS being seen as utilitarian when we talk about multifunctionality and aesthetic value and things like that as well.
Okay. And there's maybe I can take a last question before we have a more of a wrap-up one. We have a question around the rural and urban environments, and the question is the implementation of nature-based solutions focused equally on both rural and urban environments, or is there a greater focus on one or the other? And there's an additional comment that it's a bit strange to talk of nature-based solutions in a rural environment. There are nonetheless environment issues there as well. Okay, so anybody wants to comment on the prevalence of NBS on being focused either on rural or urban environments?
I'm dying to respond to this. Can I?
Yeah, you can.
I think that we hear so much about nature-based solutions in urban areas, and these are the ones that are really visible, where we're creating a brand new ecosystem in an area that has previously not really had an intact ecosystem. But we don't hear as much about the nature-based solutions that involve protecting and conserving natural landscapes or enhancing natural landscapes, on, say, a catchment or river basin scale. And these are the rural solutions. If we think about conservation agricultural practices, these fall under the umbrella of NBS, and these have been popular for at least 40 years that I know of, probably longer. But there's certainly a rural flavor, and it's not at all strange to think about nature-based solutions in a rural environment. And in fact, it's really critical that we do, because what we want to do is connect all of our anthropogenically influenced environments with nature. So I was dying to say that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good point. Any compliments?
Yeah, if I can just put forward that when we analyzed the result for the mapping that we did from the project, that there was a lot of urban projects, but also a lot of projects in rural areas and in freshwater environments, in coastal environment as well. So I think there's a lot of things happening, but it is true that there is still and was a huge focus on NBS in urban setting. I think it was a kind of a first communication that happened strongly were on those solutions in urban setting, but there is a lot of things happening elsewhere. And as Laura said, I think we need to connect everything and put forward everything, because it is really important in rural areas to implement NBS, and not only the restoration, the creation of new environment, but also the protection of environment. I think it's really important to consider this NBS, because they are and not always taken into account.
And maybe also the term NBS as such has been more used in urban environment, whereas a number of actual practices in rural environments fall under this umbrella as well, but maybe not referred to as NBS explicitly, and typically green and blue infrastructure and aspects like this. So, and just to flag, Marianne was referring to, we did a review of Horizon 2020, Horizon Europe by the RISA and Interreg projects, using keywords to identify NBS projects and NBS related approaches project, even if they don't state it clearly, the term clearly. And this will be made available also for you to check what's urban, what's not, on NetworkNature in a couple weeks time. Okay, and I can maybe, so to close this webinar, we had a last question for you. Where do you see nature-based solutions in 5 years' time, ideally? And what would be the role of research and innovation in this vision? And maybe I can start by giving the floor to Laura Baroni, if you want to start with this opening or closing question.
Thanks. Yeah, so I would like to see NBS being much more widespread, both in urban and rural settings, and also, yeah, designed and managed with the help of citizens and stakeholders and local businesses that can benefit from them. And this will have been underpinned by further advances in the research and innovation sphere. So we will have more robust data on costs and benefits and effectiveness. Yeah, and they will be more the norm rather than the exception or novelty.
Excellent. Mariam, do you want to add to
Yeah,
this?
I think I can agree that I would love for NBS to be more mainstream and more known for in next 5 years, and to have, and I think research and innovation have a great importance for it to do, to kind of work into the implementation of NBS into different contexts for it to become really well known. And I will just be really happy if we agree on standards for NBS to really take into account biodiversity every time, to take into account local community every time. I think it's really important, and I hope in 5 years it is clear that some things are not NBS and should not be considered NBS, and others are. And I think, yeah, it's really important to kind of see what is and what is not, because monoculture is not NBS for climate change. I'm sorry.
Laura?
No, I agree with what both Laura and Mariam have said, and I think that, as Mariam's indicated, the establishment of standards, that are fairly comprehensive, is really required to fully and meaningfully integrate NBS within multiple policy instruments. But we're moving in the right direction. We just need to keep going.
We'll need to have this webinar again in 5 years' time to see where we stand, and we'll revisit this statement then.
Exactly. We'll do. We'll take you on this. Okay. So thank you very much to our speakers, to our participants for the excellent discussion. Also, we are even a couple of minutes over time. As mentioned in the chat, you can access this webinar's recording on NetworkNature. It's part of the first series, so subscribe to our information on networknature.eu if you want to follow up on the next ones, if not done already. And yeah, I guess the key messages from this last question, it's the design and management with people, integration of people, society in NBS, the standards, local communities, the widespread mainstream. I think this is the vision we want, and I liked Laura Wen Ling's last word, that we need to keep pushing or keep going. That's the spirit. Okay, thank you very much to all of you for joining. Thank you very much for the speakers for the excellent discussions, and I look forward to the further series of webinars. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.